On this week's episode of the Father Dynasty Podcast, I talk getting kids into sports and 2024 Dynasty Stashes. So without further ado, what is up, everybody? Welcome to yet another episode of the Father Dynasty Podcast. I'm your fatherly host, Chew, here in the manhole, here to talk fatherhood, fantasy football, and everything in between. And rocking it solo again this week. This one will be a fairly quick one. Definitely be sure to check out those Dynasty Trade episodes throughout the week. As this week I'll be highlighting a rookie at each position and hitting a trio of trades on the Dynasty Daddy trade database. But first off, want to go ahead and jump into my Dynasty Daddy of the Week. So, Dynasty Daddy of the Week, again, each episode, each week, highlighting someone traditionally in the fantasy dynasty space, and quite often a parent, a father. And this week, Ryan Kennedy, so check him out on Twitter, at @RyanKennedy_22. Great follow. You know, I think he sets a tremendous example of, you know, being a great parent, incredibly supportive, incredibly, you know, with his interaction, that kind of stuff on Twitter. I think he's a very good follow, so please go ahead and check him out. But he had a post a couple of days ago, and it was talking about getting his daughter into basketball, and actually kind of giving her a shout out that she had made. It was the third grade girls winter travel basketball team. So saying that he got the email that she made the team, which I think is pretty awesome, and kind of a picture of her kind of sharing that journey. So that kind of brings up something, you know, thinking about, you know, having kids, you know, whether it be one, whether it be multiple, and, you know, once they're reaching certain ages, a lot of the activities do start pretty early, especially when it comes to sports. You know, how do you figure out what activities, what sports, what hobbies, whatever, you get them into? I've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, but is it figuring out, you know, how do you kind of do that balance of, I'm not going to try to relive my glory days of my sporting career through my kid, but how do you kind of let them organically experience, you know, whatever the sports may be, figure out what they like, what they don't like. You know, nowadays I know there's travel or like non-rec sports, I mean, year round for, I feel like, so many different sports at this point, which was not fully the case when I was younger. A little bit so, but you had to get a little bit older, or it wasn't for every sport necessarily. So that kind of makes me think of, you know, with my son Finn, just now turning 5, only, it was about a week and a half ago now. So, but even before that, you know, I think he was 3, and that was technically starting soccer, but that wasn't, I mean, if any parents out there know, it's not really playing the sport. It's more of like recess, but with soccer balls around the kids. So really it's more exercise than anything. But, you know, as of more recently, certainly within the last year and a half, it's been a little more technical, a little more, you know, you're really playing soccer to some degree. It's still a little bit of like a beehive or swarm of bees kind of thing, where you see all the kids just kind of following the ball. But certainly with that, you know, that's something that I played when I was younger. I think the glory days are very much behind me. But certainly with Finn, very, very active kid. I think the aspect of almost nonstop running very much fits the bill for, you know, his personality and all that kind of stuff for soccer. But also almost the exact opposite, getting him into T-ball. He did that was this year, but he did his first season of T-ball. And, you know, my wife and I weren't really certain how that was going to go necessarily because, you know, the good thing about soccer, and even he had plenty of days of doing soccer that weren't necessarily the best, you know, some meltdowns here and there, just not listening, that sort of thing. So when you think of that on the baseball field, you then have a kid who is supposed to play the infield or, you know, be in the field, and it's very possible that he's in the field and never gets the ball hit to him. And that's under the assumption that even if he does get the ball hit to him, is he even paying attention? I ended up at least for when he did, it's T-ball, but baseball, I was basically the Finn spotter, which was, I was not necessarily an assistant coach, which, when Finn plays again this upcoming season, or next calendar year, but next season, I would like to do that. But don't know much about baseball, was never very good at it. But again, something that he had talked about saying he wanted to do, and just curious to see how he would handle that, if he would like it or not. He went into it not knowing any of the kids on his team. He did end up, just in passing, we played another team, and it ended up being his what he calls his girlfriend was on the other team. So when she eventually made it to the base that he was covering, they just started talking and weren't playing the game anymore. But aside from that, me being kind of the Finn spotter, the Finn bodyguard, so to speak, was really keeping him as engaged as possible. He was predominantly in center field, left field, and then he got a little bit of time at, I'm trying to think, a little bit at second. He got some at short too, shortstop. So he's got a decent arm. He really does. It really, obviously, the biggest piece of it, as I've hinted at, obviously, is the attention span, really focusing and listening, of course, because the coaches were also fantastic too. They were very good at, as much as you can, kind of being able to guide each of the kids. And it's certainly easier when they're at bat. So then you have the one coach handling that. You then have each of the first and third base coaches are able to kind of talk the kids through it, high five them, pump them up after they get on base, and then kind of guide them through. But certainly once it's in the field, it's really tough. I would say if you have even a couple of 2 or 3 kids probably that have the shortest of attention spans. But seeing those two polar opposites with baseball and with soccer, and again, Finn did say, we've done plenty of taking grounders and throwing in stuff in the driveway in the yard. So I think he's interested in doing it again. I think it might be a similar process, but I think better because he has done it before. Hopefully he gets to play with a couple of the same kids he did last year. I'm not sure about that yet. He's bigger, so hopefully it could be easier for him to do everything. And wherever he gets to play, I think it was 2 different fields in the first season, so both of them are very close to the house, so, not too bad necessarily, but interested to see what other sports, so as I mentioned, Ryan, that was his daughter getting into basketball, and that's travel basketball too, so I'm sure, plenty of time and weekends and that sort of thing put towards that. Curious to see if Finn gets into travel sports, and if your kids are getting into travel sports, how young is that? What kind of a time commitment is that? Was it a sport that you played when you were younger? So maybe you have a familiarity, you kind of enjoy being around the sport, so being able to kind of share that with your son or daughter has some bit of an appeal to it. It's also interesting too, outside of sports, thinking about other activities that they can get into when they're younger, thinking about I feel like music and instruments is one. I know Finn's shown a proclivity to at preschool, not necessarily truly learning piano and that sort of thing, but kind of playing around with it here or there at school, and then teachers kind of telling us he does truly seem interested in it. And I think when you get him kind of focused on something that is truly interested in, he can really kind of lock into it. So that's something where I think what I think most parents think of for activities for kids, it is likely getting them into sports. Probably a big reason for that is the energy and everything, is kind of being able to kind of tire them out, have them, enjoy something, make friends or be around friends they already have. But thinking of other activities, so again, if it's something musical, whatever, it could be just them with an instrument, and maybe not in a band, just them learning an instrument or that kind of thing. And that would be them by themselves, or them, with a teacher. But anything to kind of flex those creative muscles, or just, burn that energy off, sharpen skills and mobility and stuff. I know in those couple of years going from 3 to 4 to 5, Finn's kind of mobility and awareness and that kind of stuff has changed tremendously. So it's kind of cool to see him do the same sport over that amount of time, to see how much better all that's gotten, how much bigger he's gotten, that sort of thing. So yeah, once again, want to give a shout out to Ryan Kennedy. Again, that's Ryan Kennedy _22 on Twitter. And yeah, just drop it in the comments. What is, if you have kids, depending on what their ages are, either what what are you thinking ahead? What activities are you trying to get them into, and kind of why is that the case? Is it something you did? Was it something you just think is interesting? Or even looking back, if kids are a bit older, but, when you did that when they were younger, are they still doing those things? If it's travel, have you, since they've been 7 or 8, have you been doing travel, whatever sport, for like a decade? I would just love to hear that, and always curious to hear perspectives on that sort of thing. Next up, before I jump into the Dynasty Stashes for 2024, if you're liking the episode, go ahead and like it, quite literally. And if you're really liking it, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And I'll take a quick sip of my beer to give you enough time. So just go ahead and make it happen. Oh, yeah. That's not... Okay. Make sure you had enough time there. And before I jump into these buys, also wanted to let you know, so this is being recorded as of just after halftime, it looks to be, in the Broncos-Bills game. So hopefully I will not be making as many turnovers as the Bills have today, as I see that the Broncos are up 15-8. And by the way, I did see this play just before I hopped on. The execution of that Will Lutz field goal right before the end of the half, that's incredible. I think that's what you get from a Sean Payton coached team. That showed a level of preparedness and just, ability to, I think it was in 16 seconds they showed when the play was over from that pass over the middle. Went down, had no timeouts, had to line up. The lineman shuffled around, substituted. Kicker came in. That was incredible. Anyway, jumping over to my Dynasty buys is looking for this year, being 2023, and beyond. Mostly beyond, but some of these guys do have value this year. But the thought is you get them this year, and whether it be because of a contract next year, or whether it be because of the rest of the position group next year, what it looks like is maybe an advantageous position they'll be in. So this is going to be 2 players at each position, being quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end that I'm looking at. So first up, we've got Kirk Cousins. And for all of these, I'm going to have just a reference. So quarterbacks, these are both going to be outside of the top 20 for keep, trade, cut. Again, just a point of reference that everybody can associate with. So Kirk Cousins is currently the quarterback 26 on keep, trade, cut. Mildly surprising, in my opinion. I do understand him being, I believe it's 35 now, going to be 36 next season. Hate to see how his season ended, seeing as how good he was performing before that. You did have, you have this rookie receiver in Jordan Addison, seeing how he's meshing with Justin Jefferson. You have the holdover, the steady veteran KJ Osborne. You have the acquisition from last season, TJ Hawkinson. Still trying to sort out the backfield. I know earlier in the season, as a whole, the Vikings were not doing too well, and were scrapping and clawing and coming back. And the concern was when Kirk Cousins went down with his Achilles tear, that was the reasoning for getting Josh Dobbs is, we're going to keep trying to compete. No offense to Jaren Hall, who I guess ultimately was meant to. He did start and was meant to, I think, at least finish that game out, but after 5 attempts or so, went out with a concussion. But Josh Dobbs stepping in and has performed incredibly well thus far, keeping the Vikings in the hunt. Love to see that. But for Kirk Cousins, though, tearing his Achilles, again, he is 4 years younger, I believe, than Aaron Rodgers. Of course, I'm not thinking for this season of Kirk Cousins coming back. I know with it being a couple of games later, almost a half a season later than when Aaron Rodgers did it. But for 2024, with his deal, does he come back to Minnesota? Again, that is back to Minnesota if he gets a new deal. Because the big thing with Kirk Cousins was ever since he had gotten the fully guaranteed deal however many years ago to come to Minnesota, he had gotten an extension, and this was, before going into the last year, so it was pretty secure. This year, through some wild stroke, I wouldn't even want to call it luck for the Vikings, because it's really not. He's a tremendous quarterback, and they wanted to obviously have him healthy. But this being, when they didn't give him an extension before the contract was up, he tears his Achilles tendon. Again, I think he can come back, looking forward for that to happening, but at this point, what do you do? do you re-sign him on maybe another similar fully guaranteed deal, because that seems like that's what he's expecting, but only let it be like a year or two? And not to think that his ability is not there, but just simply for the fact of you're already looking ahead and saying, all right, well, we still need to make sure we lock up our other key guys. I know they had already either released or traded a number of other, mostly defensive players over the offseason during the season. So really optimistic, I think, about Kirk Cousins in terms of maybe where he goes if it's not Minnesota. And just kind of looking around the league and looking at other teams' cap space and their current quarterback situation, what it could look like in 2024. I mean, the Patriots with $77 million in cap space, that's the third most. The Raiders with $53 million in cap space, the 10th most. And I'm not sure all the ins and outs of Jimmy Garoppolo's contract, but possibly. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, $48 million in cap space, 11th most. They will have Baker. His contract will be up. I do believe that Kirk Cousins is an upgrade from Baker, but was the thought that Baker comes in, he's just a stopgap, and then that's going to be who they draft to replace Baker. So I don't know that they would want to go for an even older veteran quarterback if they think their window is very short to be able to compete right now or in the next 2 or 3 years. Not sure. And last but not least, this will be interesting, is the Atlanta Falcons. So $37 million in cap space, the 16th most, so kind of middle of the road there. But I think, as we've all seen, the trials and tribulations of Desmond Ridder, I never thought he was the guy, and it seems like the fantasy volatile Arthur Smith doesn't think so either. And Taylor Heineke stepping in, and again, I think is a high-end backup. He again did have his time to start when he was in Washington, and didn't quite work out there, obviously. And I think a lot of people, when they saw him go into the Falcons, it's good to have that as the backup. But I think when you revert to him now being the starter, you then are trying to figure out, what is this going to look like going forward? Do we really think either Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heineke are the guy? I don't think they are. I think it's truly just an in the season, we're doing okay, and we're in an atrocious division. Let's just let Heineke wheel and deal. We'll see how it goes after the season. Probably neither of these guys is going to be the starter. So that would be interesting to see that happen. So jumping over to the second quarterback I was looking at, and this is a bit of the other end of the spectrum. So this is a quarterback who is yet to play a down in the NFL. So Hendon Hooker, QB 38 on Keep Trade Cut. So 2023, lost season for him. I forgot if he was on season-ending IR or it's just he's on the IR but not expected to come back. Again, no reason to have him come back. He was coming off the ACL tear in his final year in college at Tennessee. I mean, at this point, he was a third-round pick. Again, I think he would have been a higher pick if that ACL injury didn't happen, but who's to say that's not the game we need to play at this point. He's in the NFL. He's on the Lions behind Goff, but for Hooker, he will be 26 in his sophomore season, so next year. So a bit older. Again, tore his ACL, but presumably, certainly if he gets to rest this entire season, kind of sit behind Goff, learn him how to, be a professional quarterback, learn the scheme, learn the system. I think that could do wonders for him. Looking at 2024, though, $58 million in cap space for the Lions. That's the 9th most. And if you think about what Goff's situation looks like, so I think there's been rumblings in the last year or so, when they got Goff in the first place, when there was the trade with Stafford, it was kind of viewed as, and at the time I understood why, they were dumping Goff and his contract over to the Lions, and they were each swapping. So, the Rams were thinking we're upgrading to Stafford, and then they were able to unload Goff. It seemed to work out pretty well for the Lions, I will say. I think the organization as a whole has truly turned a corner, and I think that's very exciting. And they've been able to, work to revamp the defense. They have a strong offensive line. Obviously, they invested tremendously in the running backs this offseason, whether it be in the draft with Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round, whether it be David Montgomery, the hefty contract they gave him. So I think you've seen how they want this team to run literally and figuratively going forward. And what does that mean for Hooker? I'm inclined to believe that it will not be 2024. That is his chance to start, like the entire season. But with Goff, if they cut him before 2024, they will save $26 million and have a dead cap of $5 million, but he is an unrestricted free agent in 2025. So, well, it would be certainly a very savvy cap move if they really needed to make a lot more space, which, unless you're looking to extend probably a couple of people, I don't think you have to do that. But they certainly could. And, of course, the only reason they would do that is if they feel that confident about Hendon Hooker. I don't know if they would get comfortable enough yet. I would have to believe that Goff is going to come back, finish out that season, and then they could figure it out. I think he'll be 31, 32 at the end of that season there. So we'll see. I do believe, though, in Hendon Hooker, of course, I do have a bias. I'm a Virginia Tech Hokie, and, of course, he wasted his first couple years at Virginia Tech and then thrived in Tennessee. But I think he's a worthwhile investment, as, a lot of these guys that when they're injured, when they're just, on the shelf, so to speak, I think they're forgotten about a lot. Jumping over to the running backs. So these are a pair of running backs that are outside the top 40 when it comes to keep, trade, cut that I'm looking to stash for next year, 2024. One of them is playing in the game as we speak on Monday Night Football. So Jaleel McLaughlin, he is RB 45 in keep, trade, cut. 2023, of course, it's still going. He has had, he ranked 20th and 9th in the past 2 weeks for PPR. And, coming off the bye, having this game here. As of now, they're winning the game. I've seen him get a couple of touches. I will say, though, Javonte Williams looks like he's closer to being back to his old self. He was coming off the knee injury last season. But regardless of that, I think when you look at Javonte Williams and you look at Jaleel McLaughlin, they truly complement one another. It is a bit of a thunder and lightning dynamic. And I think so many teams, as you see, the Panthers guard behind me as I think about double trouble and D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart. That's kind of my blueprint when I think of that thunder and lightning. And Jaleel McLaughlin and Javonte Williams do truly complement one another. When I look at how efficient as a runner Javonte Williams has been this year, hasn't been tremendous, I would say, but I think he's certainly taken the more grinding touches on the inside. And when you look at Jaleel McLaughlin, on 38 attempts so far, as excluding the game that's currently happening in Week 10, 7.1 yards per carry. Of course, he's had a couple of explosive runs. He's had almost 3 targets a game since Week 4, so since he first started really getting involved. So I think that's pretty great. And again, with his speed and that home run ability, that's where he can really make a dent, is that catch and go. So again, in the offseason, I think a lot of people saw Samaje Perine and what he did in Cincinnati, and then saw him get signed in Denver. And then the concerns of Javonte Williams and maybe not coming back healthy, they thought Perine would just run the show either for the first couple of weeks, if not being a strong 1A, 1B timeshare with Javonte Williams once he was back. Perine has now been overtaken by Jaleel McLaughlin. And that's not to say Perine is not a good running back, but I think when you look at the way, and again, like I've mentioned for the 8th time, that McLaughlin complements Williams, I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. So in terms of 2024, looking at the outlook for McLaughlin, Broncos are not in a good cap spot. So they are the one of many teams with a negative cap, as we've seen the Saints do every year, which again, they are one of the teams too. Doesn't mean anything. They'll figure it out. Teams always do. But I think it's worth noting, though, again, I did mention that McLaughlin has already surpassed Perine on the depth chart, but they will save $3 million. I think it's only $1 or $1.5 million in dead cap if they were to cut Perine after this season. So it's not nothing, but I think when you think of a lot of the teams doing a lot of maybe of those kind of smaller moves to kind of inch closer and closer, and then maybe do some restructuring contracts after that, Perine does look like one that's going to be cut, and especially if already halfway through the season they're having McLaughlin slot in ahead of Perine. I think that's likely, and I think Jaleel McLaughlin, while he may be tough to pry away from some dynasty owners as they've seen him have his, I think it was 2 good weeks in a row dealing with the other injured running backs. It's been a couple of weeks since then. He's still done well, but with less not as many touches. So for any of those dynasty owners that have maybe forgot about how productive he was when he was essentially getting the start, getting more work, go ahead and pluck him away from them. Jumping over to my next running back, a favorite of mine, certainly coming into this season, Antonio Gibson. He was RB 47 on Keep Trade Cut, so he's a guy where it's crazy to think what his career's looked like to this point. It's a college wide receiver converted to running back, big frame, explosive guy, going to Washington in the old regime, now that I think about it, and performed as the RB1. Not a tremendously efficient runner, but just got such tremendous volume. Used some as a receiver, the irony that being that he was a receiver in college, but usually handed off those duties to the J.D. McKissicks and what have you. J.D. McKissick, of course, now retired and, of course, no longer on the team. I was now excited to see Antonio Gibson, for how he was seeing a reduction in his usage. I was like, well, you have Brian Robinson. You obviously want him to be the getting the between the tackles carries, and again, a big bruising guy. And Antonio Gibson by no means is small, but again, I think is the speedier, better pass catching element. So then I was hoping he would truly take that J.D. McKissick role. It is, of course, a new offense. You have Eric Bieniemy coming over from Kansas City. I then viewed it as like, well, could he take the Jerick McKinnon role that he had in Kansas City last year? Not so much this season. And he hasn't quite taken that. Again, the offense doesn't look quite like that, but, with Sam Howell getting just destroyed, I believe on a record pace for sacks, but really opening up the offense, very much so. And looking at what Gibson's done thus far, 4.6 yards per carry, just about 3.5 targets per game. But he has had 5 games of at least 5 targets, so he's had 5 or 6 targets in those games. And his points per game for fantasy, he's kind of on par with Chuba Hubbard and Tajay Spears. With he's at 7.9, and they're each at like 8.1. So, I know those guys are a little bit younger. With Antonio Gibson, however, when you look at 2024, he's an unrestricted free agent. And, I don't expect big money to come his way. And that's not a slight to him by any means. I think it's just kind of, that speaks to the running back market. But also I know a lot of the Devian people, guys talking about the upcoming class, and they talk about one of the underwhelming parts of it is the running backs, is you don't see any like stud guys, any Bijans, so to speak. Doesn't mean guys, as we've seen, I think a lot of teams would prefer, even if they have a running back, even if you have a Kenneth Walker, why not draft a Zach Charbonnet? So to see where Gibson ends up, we'll be curious. And he could very well return to Washington. I'm not ruling it out. He could take a shorter, not a big money deal, but something that's maybe like a 2-year deal. And, seeing him better utilized as a receiver this year in Washington, and thinking of maybe what the coaching situation could be like if Eric Bieniemy maybe truly does get the head coaching position. And I would like to think Ron Rivera stays with the team. I could see him coming in as like a president of operations kind of a role. I think he's very good for like a morale, a team chemistry kind of culture kind of guy. But I think you're seeing Eric Bieniemy doing good things with that Washington offense. Again, outside of Sam Howell being just destroyed on a weekly basis. So jumping over to the wide receivers. So these are outside of the top 60 on Keep Trade Cut. So first of the 2 guys I've got, Curtis Samuel. So ironically, I picked 2 commanders here. He is 65th on Keep Trade Cut. So he has definitely cooled off since his back-to-back top 15 weeks. But, earlier in the season, it was, we expected Jahan Dotson, who did so well last season, to come on strong. He hadn't, and it was instead Curtis Samuel, who was being utilized a bit out of the backfield, a bit closer to the line of scrimmage, a little bit of everything, honestly. Kind of that H-back production that he had actually seen in college as well. And that was exciting to see, but then, certainly in the last, let's say 2 or 3 weeks, you've seen Jahan Dotson kind of come on a little bit more. And again, that doesn't mean Samuel hasn't had a role. It's just certainly been reduced in terms of touches. But again, with that, as I mentioned on the last one with Antonio Gibson, Eric Bieniemy, I think he's pretty good at using his weapons. And again, he does have a good set of weapons there in Washington. So if your third receiver is Curtis Samuel, it's a good problem to have. And he's done good at scheming him open. So he's someone who he does enter 2024. He will be a free agent. Again, not too old as a receiver. And again, I think it could be likely that he would stay in Washington. Terry McLaurin's already signed up there for another deal. Jahan Dotson's still on his rookie deal. I do think Curtis Samuel could be had at a reasonable cost. When Washington had first gotten him on that deal, that was him coming off of his big over 1,000 scrimmage yards season in 2020 from the Carolina Panthers. And he had immediately gotten injured and a lot of misfortune there. But, I think at this point, again, he's still a young enough receiver. I wanted to say 27, maybe 28 by next season. And I think he provides good depth there, as I would like to think they continue to build around Sam Howell and hopefully protect him, because they really need to do that. Yeah, like what Samuel could be in the future. And if anything, when I think of Dynasty, I think of, you do want those guys that you think are at some point like good depth. So you could have those superstar guys, you could have the Garrett Wilsons, you could have whoever, but you do need some of those guys that they do have that boom potential that maybe are affordable enough. So I don't think it would be tremendously expensive to get someone like Curtis Samuel. And if you have enough starters that you have to have, it could be, if it's 10 or so, you could eventually, with bye weeks, with injuries, that sort of thing, would end up needing someone like a Curtis Samuel. And if you get him when he gets a touchdown, he gets a longer run, he gets those 4, 5, 6 catches, then it's a cheap way to get production. And you can't always pick it right each week, but jumping over to the second wide receiver that I have on here. So Tyler Boyd. Keep Trade Cut has him as wide receiver 68. And for 2023, it's been a lot of the same. He is playing third fiddle, if that is even a phrase, to superstars Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. But as we've seen him do, I would say every season since they've both been there, is anytime one of them is down, he can step up. Before it was both of those guys, Boyd was a back-to-back 1,000-yard receiver in Cincinnati. So I'm sure that's not to be forgotten. And I'm not saying that he's necessarily the alpha, he's the guy, but I think he's one of the best third receivers on any team in the NFL. I think that's a good problem to have, especially for as a good of a quarterback as Joe Burrow. And him being, I want to say 29 going into his age 30 season, this is likely going to be his last notable payday, I want to say, unless he only signs a 1 or 2 year deal and maybe gets another 2-year deal after that. But what I'm expecting from him, the Bengals do have a decent amount of cap space. In 2024, there were already the rumblings of they weren't able to make a deal with T. Higgins to extend him. That likely means he was going to be hitting the market. And just to think, if they weren't able to make a deal then, I kind of feel like you've got Jamar Chase. You're already going to start working on extending him as soon as you can. You sign Tyler Boyd for a reasonable deal. Again, I think his market might be suppressed a little bit just because you are going to have that influx of rookies coming in. Again, there's, as a lot of those Devy and college guys will tell you, there's a good amount of wide receivers coming out of this 2024 class. So if they're able to re-sign Boyd, and then I would assume in a round 2 or round 3 pick, draft another receiver. So it's kind of just recycling a little bit, but you're bringing back Boyd. He's already a familiar face. He's shown he can step up and be that other starter. Again, I'm not saying he's Jamar Chase. I'm not saying he's T. Higgins, but he's Tyler Boyd, and he's a productive receiver. And certainly from a fantasy standpoint, if you get to have him have a, maybe 1,000-yard season, I could certainly see that if they were able to, if T. Higgins left, they got a third-round wide receiver that they're trying to grow into a role. I think it's possible. Optimistic, but possible. Jumping over to the tight end, so the last position for this episode. So this is outside of the top 20 for keep, trade, cut. And the first one is Hunter Henry. So this one is less of optimism and talent, more just kind of situation. So keep, trade, cut has him as tight end 27. Not too old, not too young. He's kind of in the middle of everything, if I'm being honest. So he started out of the gate blazing with a tight end 1 and tight end 2 finish in those first 2 weeks. Since then, his production, much like the New England Patriots offense as a whole, has been ho-hum, if you will. So certainly no tight end 1, tight end 2 results since then. But I think when you're on an offense like that, what are you going to do? I think the hope would have been, as they've had receivers falling left and right, you had Kendrick Bourne going down for the season. Devontae Parker's been in and out. Juju Smith-Schuster, I don't even know. There's that whole thing however many weeks ago about like his knees possibly exploding. I don't understand that. And Demario Douglas, don't even start on that guy. He's a stud. So I know that's an overreaction, but huge fan of his from a dynasty perspective. But when you see that, when you see Mac Jones's wavering production, you have to think, Hunter Henry going into 2024, he becomes an unrestricted free agent, and that's after him getting that sweet deal. Is actually he and Jonnu Smith both getting pretty solid free agency deals to join the Patriots in that same season. And, this could be his last bigger deal that he could get, 2-year, 3-year deal maybe. And I think he's not done yet. I think he's a solid tight end. I know earlier in his career, he was thought of to be one of the not next greatest, but again, a very solid, above average tight end. A lot of it was derailed by injury and that sort of thing, but now the last couple of years he's been clipping along, and I think he'll find himself on a different roster. And who knows, after him getting that last payday, the big payday in the last round of free agency, not that he wouldn't take the money, but maybe he'd look for a better situation, a better quarterback, a better offense, and again, could produce, maybe won't get paid as much, but I think maybe thinking about his kind of record, as a football player, and maybe getting a ring, who knows. So jumping over to the final tight end and final player that we're stashing for Dynasty for 2024, that would be Jelani Woods. Not a name we've heard in a while. Jelani Woods in keep, trade, cut is the tight end 38. Hamstring injury has left Woods off of the field, and rumblings he could be coming back sooner. We don't know for sure because we haven't seen it yet. And considering what's happened thus far, you've had Colin Granson and Alec Ogletree step in as the, I guess, co-starting tight ends. I can't remember which one is technically the starter. I think it might be Ogletree. But at this point, I think you chalk this up to a lost season, and not as a diss to Jelani Woods, but more so Anthony Richardson, he looked good when he was in there, but he's gone. Jonathan Taylor didn't come back until a couple of weeks into the season. Got his extension. Didn't look great initially. Started looking better. You still also already have Zach Moss, who did pretty damn well in Jonathan Taylor's stead. You've got Michael Pittman, who is a strong wide receiver 1. Alec Pierce, a guy I like a lot, and I think has not gotten as much production, at least this season. And a guy who I am a huge fan of in Josh Downs. I'm so glad to see him doing what he's doing in his rookie season, especially that catch that diving catch that he made. Minshew spinning out in his own end zone. I think it was just under a 30-yard diving catch. So excited to see him blowing up like that. But yeah, I think next year, if you see Jelani Woods sliding back into his role, if you see all the rest of those offensive weapons healthy, that big 6'7" frame for Woods, I think that's going to bode so well for him. I think they're going to be able to spread that field out a little bit, and certainly when you consider Anthony Richardson's rushing threat, you have to consider anything, and then that hopefully will open up the opportunity for Woods to be stacking up them touchdowns. But yeah, we will see. Optimistic for him. At a minimum, again, as I mentioned a couple of players ago, you have these guys that maybe are not superstars, but have shown and have flashed a little bit, and they get injured. People tend to forget about them. And sometimes it's not that they forget the player. People remember who Jelani Woods is. But maybe forget about his impact and like what he had done when he was playing. And even if it was in flashes, it was his rookie season. So next year he'll be heading into his third season. He'll be with what would then be a sophomore quarterback who is still kind of a rookie in terms of his numbers of starts, but optimistic as that with that Colts offense as a whole once everyone gets healthy and keeps going. So that is it for this week's episode. And I guess for my signing off, this is not necessarily a inspirational quote, but in the wise words of Adam DeMamp, take it sleazy, and I'm out.